This afternoon's program is co-sponsored by the Political Theory Colloquium of the Government Department and Program on Constitutional Government. And our speaker is Maurizio Viroli. He's a professor formerly at Princeton, now moving to Texas. He's the author of a slew of books, not several as it says here, but many. But we'll mention Machiavelli and Niccolò's Smile, The Meaning of Machiavelli, Machiavelli's God, as well as For Love of Country. He writes about religion and patriotism. That's unusual. And his latest book, which is the title of his talk today, is Redeeming the Prince, The Meaning of Machiavelli's Masterpiece. I add that Professor Viroli is Italian. And he was born in Forlì, which was the scene of a memorable episode. Mentioned 3 or 4 times by Machiavelli, with the Madonna Caterina Sforza. And he, being Italian, speaks with verve and grace and learning.
Thank you so much, Harry, for inviting me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss the main argument of my last book with some refurbishments. The problem with being Italian is that I speak with an Italian accent. Even after 27 years at Princeton, I have not lost it. It's why an inconvenient friend.
You didn't want to speak like them.
No, I tried. An inconvenient friend once said, Maurizio, you've been teaching so many years at Princeton that you still speak like Robert De Niro. That was not exactly a compliment. But Harvey, I'm very grateful to my friend and colleague and Harvey Mansi for this invitation. He was generous to mention that I was born in Forlì. I think that a memorable episode is probably the only memorable thing that has happened in Forlì since the 15th century. And it's Machiavelli's invention.
Oh, is it?
No. That story is completely invented by Niccolò Machiavelli, who was a man of great fantasy and imagination. Even though he writes in The Prince, as you know, non voglio andare, molti hanno scritto, many have written imagined republics. Problem is that he was very imaginative himself, but on that more later. I will be very brief because I'm anxious to listen to the vehement and severe criticisms that no doubt have been prepared to welcome me properly. So I will restrict my presentation to the most debatable points, which are the followings. I think that the meaning of Machiavelli's Prince, and when I say the meaning, I mean what he meant to say, how he wanted to be understood, what he really wanted to teach, what he really cared about, the main goal he wanted to intend to achieve in writing The Prince. That's my meaning of meaning. And in my view, the meaning of The Prince is, let's say, first what it's not. He did not compose The Prince 500 years ago, more or less, to get a job from the Medici. This is such a triviality that can be dismissed with very few words. And I will give you, if you want, the evidences for this. Since it has been repeated, is repeated over and over, he wrote The Prince to be back in office. It's worth mentioning. Machiavelli did not compose the Prince in order to assert that political action is autonomous and independent from ethics. This too is a commonplace that has no basis in the text. He has not composed The Prince in order to to inaugurate or to found modern political science. He is not the founder. He never intended to be the founder of modern political science as we understand it. So then, what was the goal of the Prince? I think Machiavelli composed the Prince in order to design, invoke, instruct a prince of a special sort, that is to say, a redeeming prince, the redeemer, a redeemer of Italy. That is what he exactly wanted to explain in the Prince. This means that if we want to understand the meaning of that text, we have to focus on the last chapter. Chapter 26, the exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. What Machiavelli does in that chapter is to elaborate a myth. There is no question about it. And if we read the entire Prince from the perspective of the last chapter, then I think that many issues that have been hotly debated in the literature are still hotly debated among scholars. They assume the right light, they become more comprehensible. Well, you know the exhortation. I don't want to enter in the detail. It's the place where Machiavelli compares the conditions of Italy to that of the people of Israel enslaved in Egypt, to the condition of the Athenians before they were unified by Theseus, to the condition of the Persians under the Medes' yoke. Machiavelli writes, Italy was his time, more enslaved than the Hebrews, more servile than the Persians, more scattered than the Athenians, without a leader, without order, beaten, despoiled, ripped apart, overrun, having suffered every sort of ruin. She is praying God. That's what Machiavelli, she is praying God, to send someone to redeem her. Do not faint, that's exactly what Machiavelli writes. Italy prays God. And Machiavelli describes the Redeemer as a compassionate response of God to Italy's prayers. Then Machiavelli insists that and the great Redeemers, the models, the examples were Moses, Cyrus, and Theseus, who were surely, he writes, rare and marvelous men. Yet they were men. And therefore they can be imitated. The conclusion of the exhortation has a clear prophetic tone. Machiavelli promises the friendship of God. Says, God would be a friend of you, possible Redeemer of Italy, just as he was a friend of them. He is referring in particular, of course, to Moses. Now, assume that for a moment, just for fun, assume that I am right. Just assume it. Yet you would like to have some textual evidences for my thesis, which is not that the exhortation is important. I am more intrepid or audacious. Namely, I think that is the center of the book, the exhortation. Which evidences do I have to make such a claim? The first comes from an overview of Machiavelli's entire corpus. Now, in all his works, his major and minor works, the theme of political redemption is central. He writes the discourses on Livy to inspire some people in future generation to redeem the present world from moral corruption. He writes the art of war having in mind someone who can redeem or resuscitate the ancient military valor of the Romans. He writes in the discourse on remodeling the state of Florence, 1520, you find a description of those who reform republics that is as eloquent as the one that you find in the exhortation. So all the theme of political redemption runs through all his works. Same, I don't want to enter into the details, but I could cite also from the Florentine histories. But that's not all. There is more, and more importantly, Machiavelli to continue to believe in the possibility that in fact turned out to be an illusion of seeing a redeemer of Italy until the last years of his life. In 1526, in March, he wrote Guicciardini a letter in which he said that for him Giovanni dalle Bande Nere, the son of Caterina Sforza, could have been a redeemer of Italy. A few months later, he writes Guicciardini another passionate letter in which he invokes Guicciardini to do everything he can per liberare l'Italia da queste belve che di umano hanno soltanto il volto. Free Italy from those beasts that have nothing human but their face. It's the exhortation, again, the theme of liberating. Harsh words, no?
Yes.
Also being invaded was not nice, you know.
No.
Not classy, let's say that.
Nothing.
No, not at all. So I think that a man who has written all his works, in all his works he has important pages on the theme of political redemption, and who has been hoping for all his life to see a redeemer, well, it's quite reasonable to assume that he has composed the Prince in order to create a redeemer, to create the image of a redeemer, to inspire a redeemer. The second reason that I can offer, textual evidence I can offer for my thesis, has to do with the subject of the Prince. What is the Prince about? Normal answer is about politics. The normal answer, the conventional answer, is wrong. It's about grand politics. In fact, Machiavelli flatly says that I'm going to speak about the deeds of great men, I grandissimi esempi, the most excellent examples, imitare gli uomini eccellentissimi. Who are these great men? Who are the most excellent? The most excellent are the redeemers for Machiavelli. There is no question about it. So the book is about that type of prince, a particular type of prince. In the third piece of evidence that I'd like to present in my defense, in defense of my thesis, is that Machiavelli anticipates the argument of the 26th chapter in chapter 6. Already in chapter 6 you can see that he speaks of Romulus, of Moses, of Theseus and Cyrus, stressing that they had the opportunity to show their greatness, and they did it. Therefore, they accomplished something really great, such as liberating the Persians, unifying the Athenians, and, but above all, emancipating the Jews from the Egyptian bondage. In fact, in my view, the real hero of the prince is Moses. In this, what I mean to say that already in chapter 6, Machiavelli suggests the reader to focus on that idea, on redeemers, as the key figures of his text. Another evidence that I think is particularly important has to do with the structure of the text. As you know, it has been claimed many times that Machiavelli's Prince is a text of a political scientist, written coldly, as if Machiavelli were an observer of reality from a distance. The truth is that Machiavelli's Prince is an oration, from the first line until the last. Oration in a technical sense, not in a pejorative censor, in a good sense. When I say it's an oration, I say that you can clearly see that the Prince is written following the rules of the ars rhetorica laid down by the Latin masters of eloquence, particularly the Aderenium, the Rhetorica Aderenium. You can see that from the order of the text, from the way he explains his points. Just to give you an indication, Machiavelli is a master of the technique of ante oculo sponere, which means that if you really want people to understand the concept that you want them to understand, you should use images, metaphors, examples. Okay? You know that. But now, I'm sure you are, you are considering a thought that goes like this. What does the structure of the text have to do with my thesis that the core of the Prince is the exhortation? Well, it has something to do, and it is this. Namely, if you, rule number one of political rhetoric is that if you should, in a deliberative speech, in a speech that you produce, you deliver or write, in order to move somebody to do something, you must put the most important thing at the end of your speech, because people remember the last words you say. And what do you find at the end of the Prince? The exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. I have, of course, I've written down in the paper some arguments against my own view, but I think you need no encouragement as far as the critique of my argument is concerned. I prefer, for instance, the most severe objection is the following. Many scholars, Hans Baron, Sergio Bertelli, Giorgio Inglese, Mario Martelli, they all have claimed that Machiavelli composed the exhortatio after he completed the Prince. Some maintain that he composed it in 1514, others in 1515. Martelli even claimed, Martelli is the editor of the best scholarly available edition of The Prince, claims that Machiavelli composed The Prince in 1518. Now, if they are right, my whole interpretation miserably collapses, and I will go down in history in infamy. But I think I have ways of defending myself, but that I reserve my defenses for later. What I want to end with is what I think the most compelling evidence I have to offer, which involves a small, modest, methodological innovation. You know, we have to be prudent with innovations, but sometimes. And the innovation is this. I think that for people like myself who have devoted their lives following the methodology of ideas in context that I learned from Maestro Quentin Skinner, we focus on concepts, on language, on ideas, no arguments, conventions, you know that. But I think that there are cases in which you should really focus on human beings, on the authors, on lives, on their beliefs, on their passions. And what does the life of Machiavelli reveal us as far as the composition of the Prince is concerned? It reveals us something rather relevant. Namely, that you read his private correspondence, you can see that until January 1514, Machiavelli is a defeated man. You know the story. But he's fighting back. He's trying to resurrect. He's trying to be again himself. But after that, beginning of the summer of 1514 until 1518, he has given up all thoughts, all concerns about the great things. What I'm saying is Machiavelli of 1514 is no longer the man of December of 1530. You remember the beautiful letter of December 10, 1513, when it says that in the evening he reflects and writes on the great deeds of great men of antiquity. Non sento la povertà, non mi affligge la paura, non mi sbigottisce la morte, tutto mi trasferisco in loro. I transfer myself in them. I no longer fear death, I no longer have anxieties. He is himself when he thinks about those great deeds of politics. Who is Machiavelli in 1514? He writes in a letter of August 10, 1514, he says, I no longer delight myself in reading about grandi cose. All he is doing is, he is in love with a woman, so he says, I no longer delight myself in thinking about great things. I believe that a man who in that moral and personal condition could not possibly have had the strength to write a text full of hope, full of determination, of moral energy, like as the exhortation. So I insist, internal evidences, the life of Machiavelli, everything indicates that the center of the text is the prince. The center of the text, is the exhortation. And the question, I want to end this brief presentation by raising a simple question. How does the prince end? As you know, it ends with some verses taken for Petrarch. Virtù contra furore, virtue against furor, will take up arms, prenderà l'armi, e fiel combatter corto, the fight shall be short, perché l'antico valor, because the ancient valor, in the hearts of the Italians is not yet dead. He ends with these verses. Why to end a book on princes, on the prince, with verses from Petrarch? Because Machiavelli believed in the prophetic power of poetry. Prophetic power of poetry. He writes down in the Florentine histories that poets many times have prophetic and divine force. So Machiavelli ends the prince with the verses of Petrarch because he wanted to present a prophecy, the prophecy of the Redeemer. That is the center of Machiavelli's princes. The implications are quite interesting, but I leave the discussion and the analysis to you.
Welcome.
So we have a respondent, Rory Schachter.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your paper. It was lovely to read. I especially savored these letters you reproduced, especially some I'd certainly never seen before, about him falling in love with a woman and giving up all grave matters and perhaps philosophy. I guess I would just say about the letters, again, and this isn't a question that could be answered maybe here, but just if one would have to look at each interlocutor and try to develop some kind of idea of how frank Machiavelli was being and the sort of relationships he's had. And so I'm sure you could speak more. Yeah, that how one would do that kind of contextualization. But on the main thesis of the paper, well, let me just say that I wasn't persuaded, but I don't, think I can refute the thesis. I guess I can offer a counter thesis and perhaps provoke debate. I mean, I would say, to summarize my counter thesis, that the book seems to me, but again, I can't really prove this fully, primarily a teaching not to project the myth of the Redeemer into the future, but as a teaching of the founder, who is Machiavelli, so that he is the prince founder. Now, it's difficult to say what it is meant by redeemer versus founder. The word founder is all over the Prince, and other places redeemer is not as much, although anyone who restores a corrupt republic would be a redeemer. I guess there's a religious issue. You could say that redemption implies the idea of sin, and you could call into question whether Machiavelli believed in the idea of sin, since the teaching on necessity seems to be that we're forced into sin, which would mean they're not sins. But leaving aside that nomenclature, again, just to try to sketch this counter-thesis, I mean, on the face of it, the difficulty with your thesis is that one would wonder why any one of 26 chapters in an extremely short book would be the center or locus. I mean, wouldn't one just sort of memorize the entire thing? I mean, it's very short. People used to memorize the Bible. It's much longer. But if we do take this idea of looking for a central chapter or inlet, I mean, I would just wonder whether one could make just as strong a case for chapter 15, in which Machiavelli announces that he departs from the orders of all others and that he goes to the effectual truth, and he attacks imaginary republics, so the classical and Christian tradition. And so this would make him, as I said, the founder, the Prince, in an intellectual sense. And I think the implication would be that the political redemption that he dreams of might turn out to be more vast than you seem to sketch. That is political in a broader sense. Not to offend Italy or the Italians, but just as it might be trivial to interpret the Prince as primarily a job application, one might ask why the unification of Italy is anything but essentially trivial from the perspective of world historical politics. It seems the only great significance of Italy in his time was that that's where the church was, and so one would ask whether perhaps the barbarians in the exhortation are the Christian leaders or those intellectual teachings that support their reign. Just to kind of try to buttress this challenge by looking at chapter 26, I guess there's two striking things I immediately noted. He says in this rhetorical fashion, what envy could oppose him, the Redeemer Prince? But we know that inevitably any new prince will encounter envy. So that seems on its face to simply be a strange thing to say, unless it would be Machiavelli and he'd be dead and then they wouldn't envy him in the conventional sense. The other kind of more bizarre thing, which is obviously not the first to note, is he says that Lorenzo should take heart, for here may be seen, I'm just quoting, you quoted in the paper, here may be seen extraordinary things without example brought about by God. The sea is opened, a cloud has escorted you on the way, the stone has poured forth water, here manna has rained. So first of all, I guess it's not the same order as in the Bible. I'm not really sure what to make of that. But certainly these are not events without example. I mean, he gives an example from the Bible. And so it would seem that one would have to look at chapter 26 as somehow ironic or satirical, in as much as it's supposedly speaking of miraculous events without precedent, and yet obviously they have a precedent in the Bible. And one could suggest just a very basic kind of critique of the idea of revelation or prophecy, because revelation and prophecy always claims to be revealing a new truth, and therefore to not have a precedent, but to be without precedent. But here we have, again, a self-undermining example of an event without precedent. So it just seems somewhat, again, I would say satirical, and so one would wonder whether this would really be the best thing to leave on the minds of people hearing a long oration. It's a kind of odd, clumsy, biblical, scholarly mistake. And just one last point, which is that the myth of the Redeemer, the theme would be imitation. And you bring out the advice that Machiavelli gives to imitate others. You quote chapter 6 on the matter, a wise man should always enter paths trodden by great men, etc. This is presumably, I think this is real advice. But the trouble is that Machiavelli himself claims not to do this. He does not imitate others. He says explicitly that he departs from others. And so again, those who take his prophecy or his teaching could imitate him, but he claims not to imitate others. And so that just seems to me to be a problem. I mean, you also quote a letter in which he refers to, the greatness of political founding. Even those who could not do it, such as Plato and Aristotle, wrote up imaginary republics. No doubt a true statement of the greatness of political philosophy in his view, but again, he does attack Plato and Aristotle directly in chapter 15. So it just seems that, although obviously I can't disprove your thesis, if I could make just as plausible of an argument that chapter 15 is the locus, I guess that would call into question maybe looking for a chapter, a silver bullet. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Shall I briefly respond or wait? Whatever you prefer.
Maybe first. Maybe first respond and then.
Just very, very briefly. The only comment I feel I should offer you in response of your argument is this, that your considerations seem to me to have less support from the text than mine. Namely, Machiavelli's Prince and his entire corpus seem to indicate that my thesis is more plausible than yours. Doesn't mean that mine is right, yours is wrong. It seems to me that the one that I have been suggesting is more plausible. That's it. And why am I saying this? First of all, you raised the issue of frankness. Now, Machiavelli was famous in Florence for being too frank, too outspoken. A colleague of him in the Cancelleria, Biagio Buonaccorsi, once said, voi siete una cheppia. Cheppia is a small fish that swims from the sea into the river to reproduce. This is to say, a person who goes against the current, who speaks too frequently the truth. So Machiavelli was extremely frank in all his personal life, and in his letters. So there is no reason, we have no reason. The scholars have never indicated or discussed seriously the possibility that Machiavelli in the letter was not frank. So I think we should take those letters rather seriously. And that along with the letters there is the life. And the life, I think, is the response to your consideration. Maybe the theme of the unification of Italy was not that preeminent or predominant or prevailing or important or overarching in Machiavelli's scholarly production. The fact that that theme really was the theme of Machiavelli. When at the end of his life Machiavelli wrote in a famous letter, "I love my country more than my soul," no one could contest that the fact that he was really dedicated to, devoted to the emancipation of Italy. You know, it might be, I understand your view, I respect it, it might be disappointing for a philosopher to have written just for your country and not for humanity, to have written and to have struggled just to liberate and to emancipate your people, as not to have written for the truth, for humanity. But we have to come to terms that there have been, and maybe there are, people who are patriots, and Machiavelli was one. And that inspires, see, you have to, I think, makes the interpretation I've suggested a bit more plausible. And as of why the 15th chapter cannot be the center, even if it's more or less at the center of the book, because the chapter 15 is the chapter in which Machiavelli explains, leaving aside the methodological observation, the realtà effettuale, that we can discuss later if we want. But the chapter in which, like chapter 15 belongs to a group of chapters, 15, 16, 17, 18. It's where Machiavelli discusses the relationship between ethics and politics, political morality. Now, the claim that he makes, to summarize, è che il principe deve imparare a poter essere non buono. The prince must learn to be able not to be good. And the idea that the prince should be capable of entering in evil, entrare nel male necessitato, all these ideas, all these suggestions become particularly relevant if you refer them to a redeemer and to a founder. Because Machiavelli flatly asserts in chapter 3 of The Prince, as well as in chapter 30 of the third book of the Discourses, that it is in fact the founder who finds himself, the redeemers find themselves necessitated to enter in evil. And look at the example that Machiavelli offers in Discourses 3:30, is Moses. Machiavelli says, in order to defeat envy and to be able to accomplish the redemptive goal of liberating the Jews, Moses was forced to order the summary execution of hundreds of men, in fact 3,000. So what I'm saying is this, that all the points that Machiavelli develops in chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, do not stand by themselves. Do not stand. They stand if you have in mind, if you follow, if you situate them within a larger argument that ends and focuses on the Redeemer. I don't mean to persuade you just to try to amend myself and redeem myself from, from the sin of being wrong, which is a mild sin. There are worse things in life.
So, well, now, yes, other questions.
So I have two questions. One short comment about what you just mentioned about Machiavelli's frankness. And as you were speaking, and with your emphasis on the letters, I don't remember exactly where, but there's a letter in which he says something to the effect of, for a long time now, I haven't said what I think. And if I do tell the truth, I cover it up with so many lies that nobody can figure out what I mean.
Wonderful.
So that seems to indicate that he's not always being entirely frank. But my other question was, well, I think that it's very hard to disprove what you say. I think there's no doubt that Machiavelli was concerned with Italy in the way that you say he was. There's just, as you say, there's a tremendous amount of evidence in the text to that effect. But isn't it possible that, like many other great writers, he's trying to do more than one thing at a time? And that one of these things is, in fact, to do something like, something along the lines of maybe what Rory was saying, or he did, in fact, have an effect on humanism, as we all know, and an effect on how people think about morality. And isn't it possible that he did, in fact, have not only this immediate political goal, but a long-term goal of altering the way people think about religion and morality in order to bring about some form of change? Maybe not modern political science, as you say, but something like that.
Lovely. On the letter you mentioned is from May 18, 1521. And Machiavelli says, ho imparato da molto tempo, I've learned since a while, some years, not to say the truth, e se dico una verità la nascondo fra tante bugie che lì è impossibile trovare. If it happens that they say a truth, I cover it within so many lies that it's impossible to find. Ho imparato, I've learned. And he's revealing a truth to Guicciardini, because Guicciardini, Machiavelli at the time, was involved in a rather strange mission. See, since he was short of money, he accepted the mission to go to Carpi, to a convent, to find a preacher for Florence. Imagine Machiavelli negotiating with monks about a possible preacher. That was not the right place. And Guicciardini writes in a letter, be careful in Carpi, perché l'aria di Carpi rende bugiardi, I don't know why. The air of Carpi makes people turns people into liars. There are cities like that, evidently, where you go there and you become a liar. And Machiavelli defends himself in this way. But it's also documentable that Machiavelli was too frank, too open, too outspoken, irreverent, playful. And in fact, many of his disgraces were due to the fact that he was speaking irreverently. Probably the end of his own career in 1512 was due to the fact that he said about the Medici things that he shouldn't have said. And just to give you an example, when in June 1500 he was in a mission in France, he meets le Cardinal de Rouen, the most important minister of the French king, and the cardinal said, "You Italians, you know nothing about war, e voi non capite niente dello Stato, and you French, you understand nothing about the state." That's not exactly what you say in a diplomatic meeting to someone who is 10 times more powerful than you, but that was Machiavelli. These details seem to me, I know, maybe you think that they are irrelevant. They are not. I insist. If I were younger, I would propose Cambridge University to launch a new series, not ideas in context, but lives and ideas. Because when you read the page and you have in mind that the person who's written the page was that type of man or woman, the page assumes a particular color or warmth or meaning. It helps. It's not decisive, it's not conclusive, but it helps. So I thank you for having invited me to clarify the issues of frankness. You're right. In the Prince, Machiavelli wants, you put it very well, to do more than one thing at the time. There are many meanings. He meant to say many things. But, again, if the most recurrent concern of his life was redemption of Italy, nobody's perfect. If Machiavelli's, if it is an oration, if the center of his reflections in the which I've not mentioned, in the summer of 1513, was the condition of Italy within the European context, if he believed in the prophetic power of poetry, then all that invites us. It's not compelling. It's not a mathematical demonstration. It invites us to believe that the center is more plausible, what I'm saying, what really Machiavelli wanted to say was what he wrote down in the 26th chapter. And that includes the many other things he said. Just consider the issue of famous critique that Machiavelli develops of mercenary armies, auxiliary armies, and mixed armies, stressing that all these types of armies are useless. For whom are these armies useless? For everybody, Machiavelli would respond, but particularly for a redeemer, because someone who wants to redeem a country needs an extra or an extraordinary, as he writes, amount of loyalty, of devotion. Only devoted, dedicated, loyal soldiers can win a war of independence. That's what it takes. My friend George Cato is horrified by this thought and always blames on me. There is nothing to be said. If you want to win against an invading army, you have to fight. I don't know how else you can win a war of independence without fighting. And if this is the case, if it is not a mere war of expansion, for which mercenary armies are right, they can work. Then you need loyal troops. So you see, the many things that he does, they all point, if you read attentively the text, they all point to the Redeemer. Is the Redeemer who needs particularly devout soldiers. The long term, that's a fascinating interpretive issue. You know that my opponents, they claim that Machiavelli composed the exhortation in view of a specific occasion. He saw the opportunity for the emancipation of Italy and he composed the exhortation. That's true. That's true because in 1513, between August in the summer, the situation was the following. The Medici family was at the same time in the government of Florence, and they had a pope, Giovanni de' Medici, Leo X, and the the Medici in Florence. That certainly encouraged Machiavelli to write The Prince, with the focus on this possibility to have the formation of a powerful central state that could be the center of Italy's emancipation. But there is more than that. He was creating a myth that was intended for future centuries. It is clear that he wanted to create a mythical figure that was not important just in, or relevant in 1513, as he does, as he did in all his works. Remember the introduction to book 2 of the Discorsi on Livy, where Machiavelli says: "È l'uffizio di uomo buono quel bene che tu non hai potuto fare, insegnarlo ad altri." It's the duty of a good man, the good that you have not been able to accomplish, to teach it so that someone in the future, clearly, the prince, also the prince has this dimension, this reveals this effort to teach something that was valid even after 1513.
I wish I had a series at Cambridge University Press, almost like yours, but called Lies in Context.
Wonderful. I would submit the proposal instantly. I hope you would, as an expert, of course. Lies in context would be a tremendous success.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Yes.
I wanted to ask you to say more about what the actually mythic content of your use of the word myth is. So for
Mythical, yes, mythos.
So is it does it consist of poetic and poetic language relying on images, and if so, isn't La Donna Fortuna the most compelling image that we get from the prince? So what is the formal thing in book 26 that makes it mythic, or is it the substance? And in that respect, I feel that the idea that the Redeemer is somehow a friend to God, I think, has these mythic qualities, and I was wondering if there were any more. And then finally, in terms of...
Can you repeat the last, your last assertion on the friendship of God, because that's crucial to me.
So what I recognize as, okay, that's what makes this a myth would be the idea that the Redeemer has to be a friend of God, because it's this transcendental relationship that exists in the realm of mythology. And I was wondering if there was anything else besides that that made the myth of the Redeemer mythic.
Okay.
And then finally, on the intention or the addressee of the myth, I think you started touching on this, but is it, I think you want to have it both ways, that it is at once a call for maybe one of the Medicis to read this and say, oh, maybe I am that Redeemer and I can rise to the call, or it's, at the same time, it's this nice wishful thinking, this ideal for the people to hold dear to their hearts for centuries beyond. And how can that be both? And how can that be both and still ensure that the right people answer to the call? And if it is the former, doesn't that still go with the job application theory of the prince to say, isn't it a form of flattery to say, I've created this great mythic figure, and I think you can be this figure?
You know why it doesn't work this way? Because Machiavelli knew the Medici perfectly well. And he also knew that if you want to get a job, when you apply for a job and you write a letter, don't apply what I am about to say in your job applications. You have to say something that flatters those who are reading your letter. Now, to flatter, you have to say to the powerful person exactly what he wants to hear. And the Medici, had they read The Prince and read the story of the exhortation, they would have immediately believed that Machiavelli had turned insane, because that's not the kind of words they wanted to hear. We know that because we know the texts that were addressed to the Medici in forms of advices, counsels concerning what they should do, and they were completely different in tone from Machiavelli's exhortation. There is more than that. Again, you don't say if you want to flatter, you don't want to hurt the person. You don't want to tell him, look, you should really give me this job, but you are an idiot. That's not the way of getting the job. And Machiavelli tells the Medici flatly that the policy of favors that they had followed for more than 100 years was wrong. You can find it in chapter 17. When Machiavelli says that le amicizie guadagnate col denaro, friendships gained through money, they are not good, they are not solid, they are not valuable. What you need to have is greatness of soul and your own army. Now, that's the opposite of what the Medici had done. To put it, the story in a nutshell, Machiavelli was not following the Medici, was not trying to please the Medici. He was writing to make them follow him, aware, and immediately found out, because we have the dedicatory letter of the discourse in which he regrets the fact that he had believed or thought it possible that the Medici could have been redeemers. So I think these are the evidences against. But your point is more important about the mythical dimension of the Redeemer. Mythical in this sense, a myth is a description of a person or of an event designed to instill in those who read the description the desire to imitate or to follow the mythical figure. That's myth in the sense of Machiavelli. It's unique, it's exaggerated, it's vague, and it's, as you correctly pointed out, it's a work of poetry and imagination. There was no such a thing as a redeemer in 15th century Italy, in 16th century. There was no such a thing visible. Machiavelli was imagining that possibility, just as he was imagining that Giovanni dalle Bande Nere could be a redeemer. There were no factual basis for it. It's a creation of a poet. And remember, Machiavelli was not a professor. Machiavelli was not a scholar. Was a citizen with political responsibilities. Was an advisor. And I'm saying this to help you to understand the type of person. Machiavelli described himself as a poet in one of the rare descriptions that he has offered about himself. He describes himself storico, comico, e tragico. And he lamented the fact that he was not regarded as a sufficiently good a poet. That's the imagination aspect. As far as the role of the people is concerned, some of my colleagues and friends have remarked, Maurizio, the Redeemer is not democratic. Of course it's not. Why should he be democratic? There is no reason. Because Machiavelli believed that processes of political emancipation, they require a leader, meaning someone who begins the walk, someone who begins to speak up, someone who continues to walk, someone who doesn't lose the view of the right goal, someone who does not get disheartened or when he's defeated, when the movement is defeated. Does that mean that the people are irrelevant? No, no. If you read the exhortation story, in the Prince the people are absent. It's not true. The people are supposed to do something rather important, namely to fight. To fight with devotion, to fight with loyalty, to believe in the possibility of emancipation. If you look at real history, real experiences of emancipation, they are like that. There are leaders and there are citizens, there are human beings who believe in the possibility of emancipating themselves from discrimination, from corruption, from domination, from tyranny. I think that the people are important in Machiavelli in the right way. By themselves, they won't emancipate. I knew I would have started. Allegations.
I'm so sorry that I came in late.
You missed now.
Now this myth, I gather he uses the language of religion.
Good.
So the Redeemer, and you mentioned that the soldiers are to be as devout. So, do you? But you don't think that the language he uses is meant to displace, say, the conventional Redeemer at the time? Or is it? I mean, is that a possibility from your way of thinking, that it's a whole new way of looking at the world? Or are you trying to say that that this Redeemer that he's conjuring is simpatico with the conventional Redeemer? Where does he stand on Christianity? Are you saying that he's a Christian?
That's a fascinating question. What you really mean, I think, I presume, is that what you invite me to comment about is the idea that the Redeemer, Machiavelli's Redeemer, is displacing Jesus.
Well, isn't that a possibility?
Is a possibility. Is a possibility for which I do not have an answer because I'm short of text. No, but I can offer you, there is a rather, as we say, resounding silence in the entire Machiavelli's corpus on Jesus. He speaks many times of God, never of Jesus. 3 times in the entire corpus of Machiavelli, mention of Jesus. And Jesus is a Redentore, is a Redeemer. And so when Machiavelli speaks of a Redeemer, that's what I think is the line of your reflection, is he creating a Redeemer that should take the place of Jesus? Is that what you...
Yes.
It's a possibility. The answer I can offer you is this. Machiavelli was concerned, was worried. What he wanted was a political redeemer, someone who could redeem Italy and modern peoples from political oppression. He was not concerned with the redemption of our soul, or better. There is a further implication of this line of interpretation that I've tried to develop in the book Machiavelli's God. And the line is this, that to create a political redeemer with the power of words, as Machiavelli was doing, to design this figure, to give life to this myth, was for him the right way of being a Christian. Because in the Florentine context in which Machiavelli lived, the prevailing religious sentiment was one that could be summarized as follows, namely, if you want to be a true Christian, you have to practice caritas. Caritas, Deus est caritas, et caritas est Deus. That was the conventional interpretation of Christianity in Machiavelli's Florence. And so what does it mean to practice charity? That you don't want your own people, your own country to be invaded, to be humiliated. So, and in fact, Machiavelli's Redeemer, you can read in the last chapter, is supposed to accomplish the work of redemption because he is moved to compassion for the painful state of Italy. So that would be that would be the right behavior of a true Christian for Machiavelli, to work for the redemption of your country and to do all you can to make it free. That was for Machiavelli the right way of being a Christian. And that is why he was so hostile to the Christian church, to the Church of Rome, because the Church of Rome was doing exactly the opposite. So I think that there are 2 interpretations. One is that the silence of Christ is that he was not interested in Christ at all, and the other is that he was in fact behaving and writing as a true Christian because he understood Christianity to be based on caritas.
Yes, you and then Russ.
But no, she's not persuaded at all.
She's smiling.
But out of doubt and internal torment, I don't want to leave people.
Well, I'm sure we'll return to it, but for now I wanted to return to Tayoun's question, maybe just sort of rephrase it and represent it to you, because I'm not sure that I heard an explanation that I thought totally reconciled the sort of tension that I think she identifies in this paper. Which again, just to rephrase, it seems to be this seeming disjuncture between your emphasis on the grand politics of myth and the stuff that you end with from Gramsci's prison notebooks about the prince as a living text, and on the other hand, the highly specific motivation, the liberation of Italy and the liberation of Italy at specific historical junctures, whether it's 1513 or 1520, doesn't, I mean, you know, except for the historiographic question, doesn't seem to carry a lot of weight in the interpretation. Because if we take the latter, if we take your specific historical point seriously, then I'm having trouble figuring out what what's living in Machiavelli, what's so vibrant, what is this living part of Machiavelli, that's this myth of the Redeemer that's going to echo through the centuries, right? And so we can imagine a few possibilities, right? On the one hand, what's really going on here, and you stated this earlier in the talk, is that, well, look, Machiavelli was this great patriot, and so we shouldn't imagine that there needs to be anything more important than the founding of the Italian state, right? That, to him, was sort of this grand historical project, and, you know, contrariori, right, there's nothing trivial about that, right? On the other hand, right, I think Rory would seem to be right, but then what is living in Machiavelli after the foundation of the Italian state, right? I mean, it would seem to be that his project is exhausted, and it's, again, strictly of historical interest. So, one move that we could make, and in fact I think it's a move that you do make at various points in your paper, is to ratchet up the level of generalization. So in other words, okay, well, what's living in Machiavelli? He wasn't just writing, he wasn't just interested in the foundation of the Italian state, but more generally we might say in state formation. Or more generally we might say in, to put it a little more sharply, decolonization, right? Ruled by barbarians, ruled by people who aren't like us, who are dominating us in some way. And so that gives us a Machiavelli that seems sort of relevant from sort of 1850 to 1970, we might say, right? It's a great period of state formation. And of course, as the epigraph that you have at the beginning of your lecture points out, right? I mean, of course, this is the way that Machiavelli was read for long periods in the 19th century by lots of Italians and Germans, right? So that's not at all a trivial way to read Machiavelli. On the other hand, it might seem that by 1970, 1975, decolonization is over, and aside from sort of curiosities like Kosovo, we've mostly exhausted this sort of historical moment, right? We may no longer be in a period of decolonization and state formation, and so the question would again seem to be posed, well, what is living in Machiavelli? What is vibrant? What is this would you insist on at the end, right? I mean, one other possibility that I didn't talk about, but it could just be, well, it's very rhetorically beautiful, and that rhetoric can sort of have its own importance. But it seems to be that by quoting Gramsci, by ending, really, with the prison notebooks, that you want to suggest maybe another level of generalization up, that this idea, and I think this is maybe what Tayoun was pressing me on, that this idea of redemption can have this sort of more free-floating, historical, mythical quality that can, of course, be applied to lots of different situations. And that might seem attractive, right? And certainly, Gramsci had a specific kind of Machiavelli, right? I mean, we might say, well, redemption could mean redemption of the state by the working class, right? And again, perfectly, the way Machiavelli's been read, it certainly makes him seem important. On the other hand, then I think Tayoun is right that this gets pretty blurry, right? I mean, now it's just sort of this free-floating, I'm a redeemer, he's a redeemer. It's hard to figure out who's allowed and who's not allowed to answer the call. And, of course, the idea of redeeming and redemption, in particular in the United States, has a very specific and very ugly history. And I tried reading the last chapter, the Exhortation to Liberate Italy, from the perspective of what in America we call Southern Redeemers, and in fact it tracks pretty well. It reads pretty well from the perspective of someone who might have been opposed to Northern occupation and Reconstruction, right? So if that's the importance of Machiavelli, I agree that it can have this importance. On the other hand, it can seem quite dangerous, and not just because it's not democratic enough, but because the idea of redemption and the idea of evicting barbarians can have even a much deeper and uglier history than that.
Everything is dangerous in politics. There are no ideas that are not dangerous. Even the idea of liberty, even the idea of justice. It would be even too simple to cite examples of crimes perpetrated under the colors or justified by ideas of liberty or justice. That's not what worries me about Machiavelli at all, because rather something else that I find particularly attractive in your consideration, namely, if there is a value in the Prince in particular that transcends the period of decolonization, of national unity. Well, to this question, the answer I think is rather simple, namely, Machiavelli is still widely read and discussed, and I think he is of the Italian intellectuals the most translated in the world. So the question is that the history of his reception of the fortune, of the liveliness of Machiavelli's works is quite eloquent. But I think you want to know more, namely, if there is a value in Machiavelli's Prince that transcends the particular context or the particular Italian experience. There is. I think that I've said it somewhere in the paper, but let me say a few words about it. I think that without the Prince, Machiavelli's theory, political theory, would be less interesting. If we only had the discourses on Livy, we would miss an important part of a theory of political redemption. So, because even though in the discourses there are important chapters on founders and redeemers, the Prince is even more important to complete the theory. In what sense? Because the Prince tells you that if you want to see processes of political redemption, that of course in his case they refer to the emancipation from foreign domination. But in the discourses, the story becomes much more general, is the emancipation from political corruption. Then in the case of the Florentine histories, the emancipation takes the form of the emancipation from civil, destructive and self-destructive civic conflicts, the internal conflicts in the city. So the theory of emancipation in Machiavelli writings has a larger content than simply the emancipation of Italy from the barbarians. But still, in the Prince, you have a focus on the fact that you need a leader with special qualities. Now, you say that the word redemption in America evokes sinister examples. Imagine in Italy, when the Redeemer was Mussolini. Still, you give up the idea of political redemption? No. Here I'm not speaking as an historian. I have moments of weakness. Sometimes I try to even entertain thoughts. Think of that. And still, I don't think that we should give up a grand idea, a necessary idea, a fine idea, simply because there have been people who have done horrible things, pretending they were following the great idea. The great idea that Machiavelli takes is this. If you want to have political emancipation, you have to have a leader with great qualities, capable of inspiring in the people the willingness to commit themselves to the process of emancipation, no matter how hard, improbable, difficult, and painful the process will be. That is the idea that you find in Machiavelli. And since you have quoted examples, I think that history is on the side of Niccolò. All the examples that I know of successful, as much as political emancipation can be successful. Well, when I think of the American Civil War, some emancipation has been attained. Lincoln, after all, signed the Emancipation Act, no? 1863, if I recall. Well, can you imagine, 1863, can you imagine the emancipation of the Afro-Americans in America without leaders like Lincoln or Martin Luther King?
Do they need Machiavelli? I mean,
Of course.
that's sort of the question.
Of
right?
course.
What in chapter 26
We
did they
say-
need? What resources is it giving them that wasn't available to them otherwise?
Machiavelli, they read, and they probably had read the 26th chapter. They would have learned from chapter 26 that you have, for instance, you must be able to speak with a prophetic language. Don't you think that Lincoln and Martin Luther King used some prophetic language?
Do you really want me? I mean,
Sure.
yes, they had prophetic language. I mean, it's just you're certainly not making a historical claim, right?
Yeah.
That there's any direct influence or inspiration.
No,
In either case,
I'm not
right?
excluding it though.
Okay, well, I mean, fair enough. I think we can in at least the latter case, but I suppose I want to return the focus not to these sort of very abstract questions, but to the content of the paper, right? I mean, in other words, you're making a specific argument that there's this idea in Machiavelli, right, that animates the entire project, the core of which is in the 26th chapter,
Yes.
and that this has ramifications for the age. Now, I mean, I expected you to react to this by saying, well, let's not overstate the importance of sort of echoing through the ages and the stuff about Gramsci and whatever, but you seem to be very committed to it, much more committed to it than I would have guessed. And so, but now you want to read it into Lincoln and Martin Luther King. It just seems like a reductio of the argument, right?
Why?
Well, because there's nothing. I don't know how we managed to turn this around. There's nothing. There's nothing specific in chapter 26 that either of them needed to get. The American Civil Rights Project wasn't a project of decolonization in this way that you're imagining.
It was.
It,
No, it doesn't. It
It's
doesn't,
Not
it
from the
doesn't
Bible
matter. They
directly.
can't-
Didn't
they-
need
I don't want to
delineation.
take too much time, but what I'm simply saying that the general features of a theory of political emancipation that you find in the Prince has some characters that you can find in other in some relevant experiences of social and political emancipation. That's what I'm saying. That's it.
but isn't the more reasonable explanation that sort of there are currents of thought that both Machiavelli and, let's say, Lincoln share without any claim of influence, and thus without any claim of Machiavelli's specific importance, which again I took to be.
In fact, since I am a prudent man, I didn't say that Lincoln behaved and spoke the way he behaved and spoke because he has read Machiavelli. No. There are essays, I cite them somewhere, that indicate that many of the American founders had read Machiavelli attentively. I'm saying something else. Since you were speaking of the impact of the ideas of Machiavelli, I'm saying that the theory of emancipation that you find in The Prince has proved to have some relevance in specific and important processes of social emancipation. For instance, the fact that you have this idea, the idea that these experiences need devotion. Machiavelli tells you flatly, if you want to win in experience of social redemption, you need devotion. You don't, self-interest, just to put it in another way, it's not sufficient.
Is that unique to Machiavelli? I mean, that, and you don't answer that question, but I guess that's my question here. Is any of that unique to Machiavelli?
No, because you find the same story in the Bible. So Machiavelli, in fact, in chapter 26, was largely using the Bible. I don't see any problem. If you ask me, has Machiavelli's theory of political emancipation some relevance beyond the case of Italy? I am certain, yes, it does. Because Machiavelli puts the emphasis on some essential condition that you need to have if you want to hope to win not in politics in general, but in a process of redemption. First of all, you have to believe it, that it's possible. That's something.
Michelle Clark from, this lady has come all the way from Dartmouth.
I have.
Dartmouth.
And I got here
Dartmouth.
late after
Yes.
all that.
You mean the pronunciation is Dartmouth?
Yes.
Not Dartmouth.
No, that's wrong.
I'm wrong. Sorry.
Okay. So I had a pretty simple question, but one that I've been puzzling over for a while. So I was wondering if you could say more about what you think Machiavelli believed Italy needed to be redeemed from. So the language of slavery and redemption, as he uses it in The Prince, has always seemed strange to me insofar as it doesn't map onto the picture of Italy that he sketches, right? Which is, to put it simply, a region in which no one is in charge. And, you know, so the peninsula is subject to these waves of princely ambition from outside, also from inside to some
Sure.
degree. Continually, and it has been, as he understands the history of Italy since the fall of the Roman Empire. So if you look in the first book of the Florentine Histories, right, this is the picture he sketches there. And so we have this place in which it's, you know, Italy is a place that's continually subject to princely ambition, and yet it never gets anywhere. Right? Nothing is
That's
ever
exactly right.
created, nothing is ever founded. Certainly no princely power is erected with any sort of success, right? And so in what sense do you think he thought it made sense to talk about Italy being enslaved if there in fact is no master?
The word enslaved recurs in Machiavelli as an analogy for rhetorical purposes. Now, rhetorical means that you write trying to touch the passions of those who are reading or listening what you're writing or saying. So enslaved is a strong word, as you said. Technically, in 1513, Italy was not yet under the direct domination of a foreign power. It was about to be, but you are absolutely right. When Machiavelli says, più schiava degli ebrei, more enslaved than, più serva dei,
It's a big claim.
is a big claim. Yes, in order to emphasize the painful condition of Italy and motivate and stimulate the compassion for the victim, for the enslaved, servile, and oppressed nation. You are absolutely right. It's an emphatic expression that is perfect for that type of text, being an exhortation. Exhortation is not an analytical essay. An exhortation is meant to move, and move in order to move. I move your passion to move you to act. That's how an exhortation should work. And but the content of redemption, if you want me to focus on the Prince or also in the other text, on the other texts,
I just want to hear you talk about it.
sure, it is much larger. Because, for instance, in the discourses, many chapters deal with emancipation from tyranny. You know that Machiavelli ranks tyrants as the worst possible human beings, second only to the destroyers of religions. And then there is the emancipation from corruption. Corruption simply means in Machiavelli has many meanings, but certainly, as far as redemption is concerned, is a form of moral weakness, whereby you simply accept the domination of a powerful man. And then it's also corruption understood as the willingness to serve powerful men in view of favors. That's corruption from Machiavelli. And then last, the most fascinating of all, is the emancipation for Machiavelli from bad religious practices, from bad religion. You know, chapter.
About that, you two can agree.
I think is perhaps one of the few things.
I want to drill down into
Or-
So how do you deal with Cesare Borgia? Is he a redeemer?
No,
Well, he's held out for imitation.
only in part because remember what Machiavelli writes about him. There was a glimpse, someone appeared who might have been. We were hoping he were. And people, commentators say he is referring to Borgia. I think that's true. But the other line, Machiavelli writes, ma è stato reprobato dalla fortuna. You know this word, reprobato?
Yes.
Quite a word, no?
Yes. It's happening to me.
And to me as well. But we don't qualify as redeemers unless you have changed your views.
Yeah.
No, in reprobato, reprobato is the punishment you get for having offended God. It comes literally from the Roman law. And so that gives quite a sense to that phrase. So Valentino, the Duke, was not quite the right person because somehow he was not a friend of God. He did not have, because, and why is it? Because if you read carefully all the lines, formidable, beautiful, that Machiavelli has written about the Duke whom he met in June and September 1512, and then in December 1502, and then in Rome the following year. Machiavelli never says that the Duke was after a project or an ideal of political redemption. He wanted glory, he had great soul, he was courageous, he was audacious, but not so much concerned with the redemption of Italy.
Okay.
So he doesn't qualify. And in fact, he is not in the top list.
No, but he's said to be imitated.
He should be imitated.
That's quite a striking recommendation.
For those things, sure. He should be followed for the way he was recruiting soldiers, capacity of seizing the occasion. Oh yes, but
You would never hesitate to recommend him for imitation.
no, that's what he says.
Yeah.
But still, when he presents the final list, the short list of redeemers, he is not considered for the job. If you allow me to use this language, it is familiar both to Princeton and Harvard.
Thank you. Russ. This man is also from Dartmouth.
Dartmouth.
Oh, sorry, Dartmouth.
You said
Is that how you say it?
You said that.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was Dartmouth.
Oh, okay.
You were right, I guess.
Oh, okay. That's a consolation.
To return to imitation and enslavement in religion, I wonder what you would say to someone who said that Machiavelli can't be indifferent to the Christian Redeemer because the qualities of character exemplified by the Christian Redeemer are impediments to the political Redeemer, as are the qualities of character of the Socratic Redeemer, and the philosopher without whom there'll be no rest from the ills that beset cities is the Socratic Redeemer, but those qualities of character are also impediments to the success of the political Redeemer. So to admire the political Redeemer, to confer glory upon the political Redeemer is in the way that Machiavelli asks whoever understands him to, would require demoting the Christian and the Socratic Redeemer, maybe cleansing politics of their force.
It would Machiavelli's Redeemer certainly goes against the Gospel, but not against the Bible, not against the Old Testament. In fact, Machiavelli cites on his defense Moses, the case of Moses. That's why I have been focusing so much, and perhaps too much, on this line about the friendship of God. What does it mean to have God as a friend? I don't know, because I've never had God as a friend. But in Machiavelli, to have God as a friend means that a friend understands, is understanding. Therefore, he excuses you if you do something wrong in order to attain the goal that he, the friend, God, wants you to pursue. That's how it works. That's why I see a difference between the way Machiavelli describes how are judged princes who perpetrate cruelties well used, and how can a redeemer be judged. The redeemer can count on God's friendship, which means that you are excused, you are understood if you use a cruelty. The words that Machiavelli uses when he speaks of crudeltà ben usate, he says that the prince can have with God some remedy, is less justified. It's not as justifiable as the redeemer. But definitely, and your point is absolutely right, except that Machiavelli uses the Bible to sustain his political redeemer. To the question, do you think that, do you, Machiavelli, think that you are anti-Christian because you are claiming what you are claiming about the use of cruelty, deceitfulness? Do you think that I think he would have said no, it's perfectly compatible. It's perfectly compatible with the teaching of the Bible.
Eric.
Actually, what I wanted to ask follows up on Russ. I wanted to ask about your view of his theology. I mean, that is whether he takes it seriously or not. What's the theology that he's putting forward? Because he has this claim, and this gets exactly to what you were just discussing in the Discorsi, in the second discourse, that there's a kind of true Christianity as opposed to the degenerate, corrupted Christianity of his time, and this Christianity would be patriotic and therefore not incompatible with Machiavelli's sort of political thought. And it's always struck me that whatever that's going to mean is implicated very strongly in exactly the passage that you were citing from the final chapter of The Prince, where he gives his statement about theodicy and free will. I mean, where the adjustment to the Dante is, well, why is he giving us free will? So that we can have our share of glory. Right? I mean, he wants to leave us partly free. So, I mean, are you attracted to the idea that he's that if you wanted to situate this on the sort of spectrum of Christian theology, that he's pushing towards some version of what would emerge as Arminianism, sort of in the next century? This idea that, I mean, structurally it seems to look like it. So yes, we're not Socinians. We don't deny that grace is necessary. We can't do it all ourselves. We need the occasione. But we can cooperate or not, and that's our freedom, to choose either to seize it or not seize it. And if we choose to seize it, we can be said to have merited election. So do you think that's sort of the idea that he's working his way toward, sort of moving away from Augustinianism in that way?
I think that Machiavelli, when he makes that assertion that you cited correctly, that true Christianity, la nostra religione vuole che noi amiamo la nostra patria, wants us to love our country. These are the words. E che siamo forti, and that we are strong so that to be able to defend it. Per poterlo to be able to defend it. This is exactly what I call the civic interpretation, Republican interpretation of Christianity, that was widespread not only in Florence in Machiavelli's times, but also in other Italian city-states, beginning with Venice. Now, when Machiavelli makes the assertion that you have isolated about a Christianity that wants you to be a good citizen, to summarize, he was simply, and I found this detail particularly fascinating, he was simply reiterating a commonplace of Florentine political and religious thought of his time. Earlier on, I cited that line Deus est caritas et caritas est Deus, which seems to come from the previous Pope first encyclical letter. In fact, it comes from one of the most popular and widely known orations delivered in Florence around 1498, so it's by Francesco Nesi. That type of Christianity was for Machiavelli exactly what was needed to have a political redemption. And it was an interpretation of Christianity hostile to the teaching and the practice of the court of Rome, as you know perfectly well. So I would situate Machiavelli in that context. And the idea of the free will is, that's why I uploaded to your citation, is fascinating. I think I know where it comes from. Because in the letter of December 10, 1513, Machiavelli has a line from Dante, cites Dante. E perché non si fa scienza senza lo ritenerlo aver appreso, ho composto De Principatius. Because Dante says that you cannot do science without putting in writing what you have learned. I've written the Principia. But where does that line come from? It's Paradiso 5, 41, 42. And what is that canto of the Paradiso about? Is about the free will. That is, it's Beatrice that explains Dante that the free will, il nostro libero arbitrio, la volontà libera, is God's greatest gift to us. The kind of gift that God does not want us to give up. And that's exactly what Machiavelli says in Chess. So I think that is the source. As far as where you want to situate Machiavelli in the subsequent developments of theological thought, I think I can offer you an indication, namely that Machiavelli's works, both the Prince and the Discourses, were much appreciated by the supporters of the religious Reformation all over Europe, particularly by the Italians who left Italy around the middle of the 16th century for religious reasons. In fact, all the Italian Protestants, Lutherans, Calvinists of various denominations, they loved Machiavelli, and in fact, just to give you an evidence...
But that would not be a Calvinist's favorite part of Machiavelli.
No, I know, but the fact is that the Calvinists loved Machiavelli. Just the example, because I like to work with examples. The first edition of The Prince in Latin was printed in Basel, 1560, and the two people who made it possible were Italian Calvinists, migrated in Switzerland. So you see how... And you know the story of how much the English Puritans loved Machiavelli for this interpretation of religion, because they saw in Machiavelli the advocate of an idea of religion, of Christian religion, that tells you that if you want to be a good Christian, you must practice compassionate love. And this means that you want to serve the common good.
And that's consistent with chapter 16 of the Prince.
Perfect. No?
Liberality.
No? You think it's not consistent?
Make your gifts from the goods of others. Is that caritas?
Of course it is. What's wrong with that? You take money and properties from a warlord and you distribute it. Let's be
I do
open-minded.
like your notion that when Machiavelli quotes something, you should look it up to see what the original says.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I had a moment of intense emotion when he cited, when we discussed the issue of free will, because I wanted to check the letter of December 10th. The letter is, we have a copy, we don't have the original letter, so I went, it's from the Apocrypho Riches, both the letters of Machiavelli transcribed. And Giuliano de' Ricci, who is the grandson of Machiavelli, corrected his secretary precisely on that point of the free will, to get Dante right. That's fantastic. Sometimes archival work is fascinating.
Okay.
You write that I'm a tough sell. You're trying to tell us that Machiavelli was an honest patriot and a true Christian. What about the way he was received at the time? You know, I'm no expert as you are, but I know a little bit of Shakespeare. And
Yes, sure.
in Henry VI, Machiavelli is adduced in reference to the Duke of Gloucester, who goes on to be Richard III. Now, I don't want to get into all these efforts to rehabilitate Richard III, but for most of us, and at least for Shakespeare, as for Thomas More, Richard III was a tyrant and not an altogether likable man. So, the murderous Machiavelli. Yeah, so this was within a century of, I don't know when the prince came to England, but, you know, published what, in 1520? And, right, so within the first 100 years, surely, the reputation was of a man who taught wickedness. How do you counter that?
Well, the story has been very well documented, namely the story of the emergence of the idea of Machiavellism has been described many times. In the center or the beginning of the entire story is in Italy, in the Counter-Reformation, within Catholic and particularly Catholic circles, emerged this attack against Machiavelli right around the time of the Council, the Concilio del Council of Trento. But what is, I think that the history of the reception and of the interpretations of Machiavelli is in itself a fascinating story, where you find exactly what I've just mentioned, namely, in Shakespeare you find the murderous Machiavelli, but in England you find scholars who asserted that Machiavelli was, exactly as you say, a good Christian and a fine patriot. Now, we have, I think, as scholars, a responsibility to try to work directly on the texts and in their own context. And it seems to me that my assertion that if by Machiavelli, according to Machiavelli and according to the largest majority of the political writers in his own time, to be a Christian, a true Christian, meant not just to go to church, not just to confess, not just to attend rituals, to give to charity, but means to act, and act in service of the common good. Then, since Machiavelli claimed, with good reasons, to have always served the common good, there is nothing in his writings and in his life. In his life? In his life. I repeat it, in his life. What has Machiavelli done in his life? Have you ever asked yourself this question? What has he done? When he was the Secretary of the Republic, what has he done? He served impeccably. In fact, he could claim, la mia povertà è la prova della mia onestà. He was poorer after 14 years in power than he was before. What has he done afterwards? He has tried to do everything he could to defend or to prevent Italy from being constantly invaded. What's wrong with that? What is not Christian about that? I don't see. If we take Christianity to mean what they meant, if we take that, for instance, as Machiavelli says, that to be a Christian means that there is a dignity in suffering, because you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, that was not Machiavelli. For him, that was the wrong interpretation of Christianity.
What's the other interpretation?
That to be a Christian means that you oppose oppression, injustice here in this world, and by doing this, you gain redemption for your soul. The two redemptions in this world and in the life after death are connected in the way that I've just described. That it was quite strong in Machiavelli's time, this assertion that you earn your salvation by acting, by practicing caritas. And caritas means not that you accept sufferance, but you fight against those who impose unnecessary sufferings. The words that I've cited, la nostra religione vuole che noi siamo forti, religious of strength. After all, what is the meaning of this word virtù? We all know that virtù comes from Latin, virtus. But in Machiavelli's time, one important line of scholarly interpretation of the Old Testament and of the New Testament as well, for instance, Lorenzo Valla, formidable scholar of biblical text, made a long case that in the Latin Vulgate and in the Christian thought, the concept of virtù is exactly strength. And he made the claim that the real interpretation of Christian virtue is a form of strength that expresses itself in the defense of the ideals of what? Of what God wants us to be. So I don't see how we can you can say, that's not Christian. You say that. I'm an historian. Therefore I have to use what they meant to be true Christianity. If this is what they meant, then all the other the consideration that I made that a true Christian for Machiavelli is someone who fights for the liberty of his country or her country, is a perfect Christian, is perfectly reasonable given what he believed true Christianity should have been. That's why he hated the Church of Rome.
Oh, all right. So what is his attitude towards the church?
Oh, you know it better than me.
I know, but I'd like to hear it.
Someone I am on my guard on this issue. In any case, for Machiavelli, the Church of Rome has perpetrated against Italy two major crimes. The first was because of the policy of the Church of Rome that Italy was still divided. Because Machiavelli said every time someone emerged who could have unified Italy, the Church of Rome called either the King of France or the Emperor to prevent the unification. For one obvious reason, because the unification of Italy would have meant the end of the temporal power of the Pope, as it happened in 1870. But the other allegation is in Discourses 112, is even more serious for me. And I think also for Machiavelli, namely that because of the Church of Rome, Machiavelli writes, we Italians siamo diventati senza religione cattivi. We Italians are without religion and wicked. Pretty harsh words, no? The place that has been the place of the Church of the Vicar of Christ has become senza religione e cattivi, wicked. Cattivi of this particular type of Italian wickedness, which is a kind of mean wickedness made of tricks, of lies, simulations. No? Well, that's what Machiavelli thought of the Church of Rome, and he put it in writing. Senza religione cattivi. But of course Machiavelli knew that Italians were flocking to churches. But to do what? For Machiavelli that word senza religione means without sincere belief that translated into coherent practices. That's what he meant. Was senza religione meant the Italians were superficially religious. But the consequence of that is one on which I want to draw your attention to. What is the implication of being senza religione? That you are unfree. Because for Machiavelli, only religious peoples were able to be free in history. you do not have sincere religious beliefs of the kind that Machiavelli was approving and stressing, you cannot be free. That is the real allegation. So the entire sentence should be completed as follows. Because of the Church of Rome, we Italians have become, without religion, senza religione, e cattivi, and wicked, and unfree.
Yes.
The chapter 26 always struck me as very different in tone from the rest of the prince, and especially at odds, content-wise, at odds with much of what had come before it, including especially on the God issue. I mean, he mentions God in that chapter 6 times, the rest of the prince altogether 6 times, and there the tone of the mentions is so different. You know, it's your fortune and virtue supported by God and by the church, you know, this hortatory presentation, but apparently pious presentation, whereas, you know, chapter 25 had just given such a diametrically different, you know, it starts off with, you know, I know that many have held that things are governed by fortune and by God. I judge that it might be true that fortune is arbiter of half our actions. It's, you know, pretty explicitly dropping out God. It doesn't take a lot of subtlety to pick up on that. And then, you know, fortune governs half, and what do we do about it? We oppose it, we beat it and strike it down. And this is in the place where people understand the power of God to consist is in this half that we're going to beat and strike down. I mean, just all 6 of these earlier mentions of God, none of them sounds the least bit pious to me. And so I'm just wondering, I'm trying to, I would have said that 26 is at odds with what comes before, therefore it doesn't explain what comes before very adequately, and I wonder how you understand those.
I say that you're right, the tone is different, but it has to be different, because in an oration, when you make, you have to have the confirmatio, refutatio, where it's you confirm or you refute your points, you assert your points. You have to use logos, you have to be rational, you have to provide empirical evidence, you have to be consistent. It cannot be a language.
But it's a different point. I mean, you could just say the main bulk of the prince destroying belief in God and morality, and you know, God is great and he's supporting what you're going to do for Italy. I mean, you know, that's crudely overstated, but
Sure.
it doesn't seem like a rational, you know, preparation for that.
Right.
If he thinks that supporting a belief in a providential God is going to be good for encouraging this Redeemer, then it seems like what he's doing prior to that is at odds with what he thinks is actually going to be most encouraging this Redeemer.
Why is it at odd what he has said before with what he says in the 26th chapter?
Well, because the earlier stuff just seems impious.
Impious.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing, like I read from chapter 25,
Sure.
that's just pretty frankly impious.
So
Whereas then he brings God back in full force in 26.
instrumentally, okay.
And it's like that suggests that he thinks that this potential Redeemer needs some belief in God, but earlier he's basically been encouraging impiety all along.
Good. So because I really want to understand your point correctly, you see that Machiavelli is teaching the prince to be impious, to perpetrate acts, to excuse acts that have the mark of being impious, and then
there are many impious
sure,
comments.
okay, sure. And in the last chapter, he introduces the friendship of God who responds to the appeal of Italy, and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, in chapter 7, Machiavelli introduces God, saying that if a prince perpetrates, use cruelties, he can have some remedy with God.
Like agape.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly.
But that's a pretty telling case, isn't it? That Agathocles is the one he cites.
Yes, but he cannot be considered virtuous, Agathocles. Machiavelli, the conclusion of that essay, of that part of Machiavelli said, that Agathocles cannot be ranked among the most excellent men. In any case, if you consider the example that Machiavelli offers in the chapter 26, and among them, in particular, the example of Moses, then what he has said, what Machiavelli has written in the first 25 chapters, does not contradict at all the idea of the Redeemer, because, as Machiavelli explains in the Discourses of Livia, Moses perpetrated cruelties. So it's perfectly sensible to say Machiavelli is teaching the prince to be impious. And then he introduces God at the end. The difference in tone that you have remarked. But I think it can also be asserted, and that's my view, that in fact it is precisely the Redeemer who has God as a friend, in Machiavelli's language, who is sent by God in response to Italy's prayers, or to the prayers of any oppressed nation or group. I could expand on this. It is particularly the Redeemer who needs, if necessary, not to keep his word, to try to be feared and not loved, not to be liberal, and not to be clement. That is what I can say. So your interpretation is possible, but I still maintain that mine, because it gives better sense of the entire work. As I said earlier on, if you read the first part of The Prince, having in mind the conclusion, it makes more sense. Within Machiavelli's whole corpus, if you consider the entire story of Machiavelli's works, what he has written and asserted. But it's perfectly, as I said at the beginning, I think it's just more plausible, not that is the only true possible interpretation.
Well, maybe we need to stop this wonderful man. Thank you so much for engaging.